If you're a British, Bangladeshi or Pakistani, the chances are you're earning far less money than white Britons. That's according to a new report that details a growing wage gap among ethnic groups in the UK. So what does it mean to be in the lowest income group? And how does the UK compare with other rich countries? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine. Now, it's a problem that many countries around the world have to deal with. How to close the wage gap between men and women, and in this case, ethnic minorities and their white colleagues. A report from the Resolution Foundation in the UK says, although many ethnic groups have seen their family incomes grow over the past 20 years, the wage gap has remained persistent. Now, the average household income for a white British family is around $33,000 a year. But at the lowest end of the scale, Pakistani and Bangladeshi households in the UK earn a third less than that, a difference of around $12,000. Now, part of the reason for this disparity could be that only around a third of all Pakistani and Bangladeshi women in the UK have paid employment, whilst almost 3/4 of white women have jobs. All right, let's introduce our guests now. In London, we have Farah Elahi, a researcher and policy analyst at the Runnymede Trust. In Paris, we have François, Gemenne, a research fellow in political science at the University of Versailles. And also in London, on Skype, we have Matthew Goodwin, who is a senior fellow with the think tank A Changing Europe. Can I start with you, Farah, because the Runnymede Trust has been involved in the production of this report. What did the report tell you about conditions today for ethnic minorities in the UK?
I think what the report reiterates is that there's significant inequality for ethnic minority communities, and what we find is that this has significant implications for their disposable income. What that means is that they have less cushioning when there's unexpected costs. They're more vulnerable to homelessness. It has implications for mental health. And the research that we've done highlights that it's barriers in the labour market that have a significant impact on these the household income numbers.
What do you mean by barriers in the labour market?
So research that was done by the Department for Works and Pensions found that if you have an ethnic minority sounding name, you have to send twice as many CVs just to get an interview. Now that's just at the interview stage, let alone in the actual recruitment process. And then going forward, we also know that ethnic minority communities get concentrated at the low wage sector. So there's an issue with progression, and kind of going up through the ranks is much harder for ethnic minority communities. And that obviously has implications for wages and household income.
And coming to you, Matthew, I mean, this sounds like the Britain of the 1960s. Why are we dealing with a problem that is so backward in terms of modern day society? I mean, this is unacceptable, surely.
Well, it certainly is unacceptable. And in general terms, inequality in the UK actually increased most dramatically during the 1980s and the era of Margaret Thatcher, but it's since then remained stubbornly high. And one of the problems in this debate, and which this report underlines, is that we've never really drilled down and looked at the ethnic differences within that discussion of inequality. For example, before Trump was elected in the United States and Britain voted for Brexit, we talked a lot about the left behind, but that was mainly framed in terms of the white working class and the white left behind. What this report is showing is that there are some incredibly deep and very stubborn inequalities across ethnic groups that we need to be thinking a lot more seriously about.
All right, and François, coming to you in Paris, just wondering whether this is a situation that you recognise within the context of France.
Well, yes, this is certainly a problem that also exists in France. I would say that the main difference with France is that it is still difficult to acknowledge it in France, and the reason for that is that France still likes to live in the myth of all French citizens being equal. So, for example, it is forbidden to collect what we call ethnic statistics in France, so that you cannot collect official data on people based on their ethnic groups, for example, simply because France doesn't acknowledge that there are different categories of French citizens. There is a wide assumption that there is only one category of French citizens and that all of them are born equal. And yet, we know that there are discriminations in access to the job market, in wages. I would just say that it is more difficult to acknowledge the issue in France than it is maybe in the UK.
All right, well, let's have a closer look then at the income breakdown in the UK, because the highest paid group in the UK is the white Irish group. Now, they earn around $36,000 a year. Now, not far behind them are white British households, while black people of African origin, they earn around $26,000. And fourth from the bottom of the list are Arab households. And as we've mentioned already, Bangladeshi households are right at the bottom of the list, and their annual income is around $21,500. So coming back to you, Farah, is there any responsibility, perhaps, that the ethnic groups themselves should take? I'm wondering whether the Bangladeshi community or the Pakistani community bears some responsibility for their rather poor performance in terms of income in the UK.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily define it as poor performance. I would say the outcomes are unequal. And what we know in terms of education data, so if you take that as a proxy for aspiration, is actually these groups perform very well in education. They have high university and higher education participation rates. So they're showing an aspiration, but actually what we're seeing is that's not translating into labor market outcomes. So there's almost a broken promise there, where communities from working class, ethnic minority backgrounds are told, work hard, pursue higher education or apprenticeships or whatever, and that will result in social mobility. And in the UK, the Social Mobility Commission found that actually that's a broken promise, and that's not translating into better labour market outcomes.
Okay,
so
Farah,
I think
I'm just wondering whether tradition and culture might play a part as well. We've already heard that the number of Pakistani and Bangladeshi women who are in paid employment is much less than that among the white community. Could this be a consequence of tradition, perhaps, where women are not usually encouraged to work?
I think there's a complex kind of system here that we need to understand. What we know about gender participation rates in Pakistani and Bangladeshi community is actually there's a significant generational change, and younger generations have higher and higher participation rates in the labour market. And I think there's a complex thing around that, about generation, about English language skills, and given the young age profile of ethnic minority communities, and the fact that for Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups, the average age is in the early 20s, actually now is the time to ensure that the people who are coming out of university don't continue to face the same barriers in terms of gaining employment and successful employment in order to move forward. Otherwise, we're going to be seeing these reports 20 years down the line showing the exact same gaps.
And Matthew, I mean, the UK generally, even in comparison to other OECD countries, doesn't perform very well. It's considered by the OECD itself to be the 7th most unequal of all 30 countries, with Sweden and Iceland coming at the top of the league. And as I say, the UK being the 7th worst performing country when it comes to equality in pay, wages.
No, well, that's absolutely correct. Inequality is a notoriously complex social challenge to resolve. We've had a number of commissions over the last 15 years that have looked at this issue, and also, building on your previous question, we've also had a number of recent national inquiries into the role of integration and social cohesion within minority communities, asking some tough questions about why we're seeing these lower participation rates and these lower incomes within those communities. And one of the recommendations, for example, of the recent Carey review in the United Kingdom was that we do need to be taking things like English language provision and training a lot more seriously than we have until this point. So there are some big debates underway and some big challenges. Of course, the macro level problem here is that a lot of the work on tackling inequality and promoting integration was really slowed by the financial crisis. And so we've really not seen that big investment that we might have seen prior to 2008.
And François, coming back to you in France, without this kind of data, the data that we're trying to get through with regard to the UK, without that kind of data in Paris, how is policy shaped to try to deal with this issue? Because, of course, it's a very serious issue which can have very serious and negative outcomes for society.
Absolutely. It is, of course, a very serious issue. In France, typically, people from different ethnic groups tend to work jobs which are often located at the lower scale of the salary scale. And the problem is that such discriminations are typically not addressed by the authorities, and the authorities often turn a blind eye on these discriminations, which, of course, in turn creates a lot of resentment amongst these communities. For example, policies like affirmative action are very uncommon in France, and there are even frowned upon the idea that some citizens would be favored over some others. So France still likes to think itself within the myths of the perfect equality between its citizens without acknowledging the fact that there are wide inequalities, wide salary gaps between its citizens according to their ethnic background.
And François, staying with you, because we've seen in recent years, we've seen scenes of great violence and unrest, particularly in the banlieue, among that group of people who would consider themselves, I suppose, to be excluded from mainstream society. Is that a direct consequence, would you say, of the neglect, if you like, by policymakers in France?
Absolutely. I mean, if you take the main riots that occurred in the suburbs in 2005, clearly the message from these riots was that the people wanted these discriminations being addressed. They wanted to be better included, better integrated into the French society, and they were feeling left out of the French society. Sometimes these riots have been analyzed and assessed as a kind of rebellion against the state and putting yourself outside of society. That was exactly the contrary. That was these people, these ethnic groups, asking to be considered fully as French citizens, and they wanted really that this idea of liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity, the French national motto, be not just a myth, but also a reality also in the suburbs, because we know that if you come from the suburbs, you will face a lot of discriminations when accessing the job markets, and also a lot of different salary wages.
Well, all of that sounds rather familiar, doesn't it, Farah? I want to draw your attention now to the recent terrible tragedy of Grenfell, the housing association block of accommodation of flats that went up in flames most terribly. Of the 68 people who've been identified as having died in that tragedy, around 57 of them are obviously classified as ethnic minority people. Many of them are Muslim. Why would so many people of a minority background and of a Muslim religion end up in such a substandard housing arrangement, if you like?
Well, I mean, I don't think their faith has much to do with it, apart from the fact that ethnicity and faith overlap. But I think it goes back to the statistics around poverty and income poverty, and the fact that obviously, if you're on low wages, or if you're struggling with finding secure income, then Grenfell was part of a social housing block, and so you're going to be overrepresented within those areas, and it's kind of, that's the makeup of that locality. But, you know, we have a huge conversation in the UK, especially in London, around the housing crisis and the challenges around buying property or even just renting accommodation, because it's very, very expensive. And really, we don't pay enough attention to the fact that ethnic minority communities are disproportionately affected, partially because of the conversations we've been having around household income. Research that the Runnymede Trust did found that if you're black, you're 5 times more likely to be vulnerable to homelessness. So all of these things connect up. Kind of income or job prospects aren't isolated things. They filter into other aspects. And kind of like Matthew was saying, when we talk about the working class communities, we've attached white and working class. But the reality is that ethnic minority communities are heavily represented within working class communities. And working class communities are very diverse. So when you look at incidents like Grenfell, you will have a heavy representation of working class communities. Sorry, ethnic minority communities.
No, absolutely. And Matthew, coming to you, give us an idea then of what the dangers are to society of having such a huge group of people who feel themselves to be excluded, they perceive themselves to be excluded, and in actual fact are excluded from the better aspects of life, the better aspects of life that are offered for most people in the UK, like education, like better housing, like health services.
Well, we are seeing, in the UK at least, large sections of the population that are feeling cut adrift by what you might call the mainstream consensus, or what some might even call the London consensus. Most of the people in politics and in media have benefited from private school education, have gone through Oxford or Cambridge, and have had a very different life experience from those in the communities that we're talking about. And over the last 2 years, we've all had a global debate about how feelings of alienation and a feeling of being left behind can result in quite volatile political shocks among white voters, but also among minority ethnic communities. Those feelings of marginalization can manifest in different ways. Some people simply give up on politics altogether. They stop voting. They stop participating. They don't feel as though the social contract is working for them as it is working for others in society. And so the big job now, the big task, if you like, is to look at that incredibly challenging chart of inequality in the UK, which has basically shot upwards and then stayed at quite high levels since the 1990s, and start thinking about, well, what are the out-of-the-box ideas for fixing this? How can we get away from a political settlement that hasn't really got us very far in terms of curbing some of these entrenched inequalities? Because otherwise we might just end up with a lot more political volatility and apathy, and that doesn't really help anybody.
And François, you have exactly the same dilemma, don't you? In France, you have a new government now, presumably with new thinking. How does the new Macron government approach this particular issue? Because you've got problems of young men who may have a Moroccan or an Algerian background, but they are French and they're prepared to take up a gun or take up a bomb and bomb their fellow and kill their fellow citizens. Clearly, they don't feel invested in French society. So how is the Macron government preparing to deal with it there?
Absolutely. This is obviously an issue that has taken center stage in France in recent years, partly because of the deadly terrorist attacks, and that has become a key priority. And there is still a wide debate in France as to why some young people, some young French citizens would actually turn their arms against their own country. And clearly there is a feeling of being disfranchised from society and being kind of lost in society, and therefore embracing fanatic causes as the only reason that would give a meaning to your life. And that will be a very key challenge of the new government, to make these people feel enfranched in the society, integrated in the society, so that they would not embrace radical fanatic causes. But yet, the government hasn't made any precise announcement about how it was planning to address this.
And Farah, again, you know, with the UK, similar problems with a large number of disaffected young men who are disillusioned and don't feel that they are represented by mainstream society. We have a newish government in the UK, but I presume the whole of the political class is consumed with Brexit and perhaps not giving this issue of inequality in Britain the attention that perhaps it deserves. Yeah,
I mean, I think what we need to see as diversity as being one of Britain's big strengths, and something that we need to make sure that we celebrate and think about the kind of country we want Britain to be, both now and going forward, and what kind of future we want our young people to have and opportunities. So I absolutely think it's crucial that even going forward, this is an opportunity to reaffirm a commitment to equality, to diversity, and see it as a real strength of this country. The McGregor-Smith review done by the government into employment inequalities found that per year, the UK loses £24 billion as a result of ethnic minorities not reaching full potential in terms of employment. So, you know, it's both in terms of what kind of the moral argument about what kind of country we want to live in and what kind of future we want our young people to have, but it's also, you know, given the fact that 20% of the UK population is not white British, this is a crucial segment of the labour market that we need to ensure is able to reach full potential.
So, Matthew, it seems very much as though the British government has a huge amount of data at its disposal, all pointing to a similar kind of situation. Is there any indication that gives you optimism that Theresa May's government is preparing to grasp this thorny nettle?
Well, the Theresa May government obviously has a lot of big things in its in tray, not least negotiating the Brexit deal and Britain's withdrawal from Europe. So I cannot imagine that inequalities among ethnic groups are going to be high on the agenda. However, what we have seen in the UK recently at our general election was a very strong mobilisation around the opposition Labour Party, which made inequality essentially its dominant theme. The Labour slogan was "for the many, not the few," which was designed to tap into that same populist sort of anger, if you like, over inequality that Bernie Sanders had mobilised in the US. And of course, what we did see at this election was a big mobilisation among Britain's ethnic minority communities around the Labour Party. And there had been talk about those communities drifting over to the Conservatives, but that seems to have been now held in check. So what I'm thinking we're likely to see if this issue is not resolved is actually greater gains for the Labour Party going into the next election among these communities. And that could force the issue back onto the agenda in a bigger way than it is at the moment. And
François, in Paris, then, what is the outlook, if you like, for this particular aspect of French society with the Macron government, and where are people of ethnic minority backgrounds, where are they looking for their political hope, if you like?
Well, I would say that this issue of inequality looms broader in France, and that's become a major theme of domestic politics following the publication of the bestseller by economist Thomas Piketty, The Capital in the 21st Century. Inequalities have been addressed by a lot of political parties, and one of them, clearly inspired by the Labour Party of Jeremy Corbyn, is called Les Insoumis, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's a kind of populist leader, so to say, which is also building on the resentment of people in the way Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn did in the US and in the UK, respectively. And this issue of inequalities is becoming a key theme of domestic politics, and the government being accused of favoring a furthering of the gap of the inequalities, and the government sometimes portrayed as the government of the rich against the poor. So this is an issue that the government will need to grasp with in the coming months.
And Farah, I'd like to end with you, if you can, very, very quickly indeed. If you had the ear of Theresa May, what advice would you give her?
I think I would give to any political parties not to take the BME vote for granted. As I said earlier, the numbers are significant, and I think minority voters, like all voters, will be looking at the offer they're given from any political party, and will be looking to see a commitment to diversity, to equality, and to human rights, and that's not something that they should take for granted, because as we saw in the last election, actually the BME vote is powerful and needs to be taken seriously.
All right, thank you all very much indeed. Farah, Elahi, François, Gemenne and Matthew Goodwin. Thank you all very much for a very interesting conversation. Now, if you want to see this programme again, join the conversation, you can go to various places. You can go to the website aljazeera.com. If you want more discussion, add your points to the discussion that we've had today. You can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. There's also the Twitter sphere, our handle @AJ Inside Story. I'm @Martine Dennis. But for now, from the whole team here in Doha, it's goodbye.